A routine cleanup of an overgrown garden turned into a shocking discovery. The gardener accidentally stumbled upon a secret door that had been hidden for decades. But what he saw inside prompted him to call the police immediately. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The first time Michael saw the mansion he was supposed to bring back to life, his breath caught in his throat. The iron gates at the end of the cracked stone drive leaned in their sockets, one twisted awkwardly and held together by strands of rust. Weeds had grown up between the cobbles, and wild grass swayed like an unkempt ocean around the path that led to the main house. Behind the gates, partly hidden by a forest of ivy, stood the forgotten giant of the neighborhood, a once proud home that now seemed almost ashamed of its own decay. He paused, with his work gloves still tucked into his back pocket, his hands on the handle of his trimmer, and simply looked for a while. There was something about the silence that unnerved him. Even the air here felt different, thicker, as though time itself had slowed and stagnated. The property was old enough that people in the town spoke of it like a wound that never healed. Michael had overheard conversations at hardware stores or coffee shops when his new client's name was mentioned. They said the family that had owned the estate had been powerful, almost untouchable, and then they had vanished. Some claimed they had fled overseas when business collapsed. Others swore that something darker had taken place inside those walls. Michael had no time for ghost stories. A job was a job, and the paycheck promised for clearing the grounds of this property was worth more than a week's usual labor. His bills had been piling up, and though he felt an odd hesitation at the threshold of the gate, he pressed forward. The house itself was enormous, built of gray stone that had blackened with age and damp. Several windows were boarded, and those left open stared out with the emptiness of hollow eyes. Balconies had collapsed in places, leaving dangling iron rails that rusted into lacework. Moss crept up the outer walls, and vines embraced the columns so tightly they seemed ready to drag the entire house back into the soil. Michael could almost imagine what the mansion must have looked like when it was alive with people and light. Grand windows lit from within, gardens meticulously tended, laughter drifting through the air. But that image evaporated quickly in the present reality of cracked glass, collapsed shingles, and the silence of abandonment. The garden was worse. Where once there must have been trimmed hedges and flowering beds, there now stretched a wilderness. Brambles twisted together to form impenetrable thickets, and saplings had pushed up through stone walkways, splitting them apart. An old fountain stood at the center, its basin broken, its figures chipped and faceless. Ivy had poured down its edges like a blanket. The whole place carried the scent of damp earth and rot, sweet and sour all at once. Michael walked slowly, making mental notes of where to begin. It would take days of backbreaking labor, but that was his craft, and he prided himself on turning chaos back into order. Yet, even as he assessed the work, he could not shake the feeling of being watched. The sensation pressed down on him as he set his tools against the wall and unfolded the schedule in his mind. He had worked on plenty of overgrown properties before, but none had made the back of his neck prickle the way this one did. A crow startled from the roof, flapping away with a harsh cry, and Michael chuckled under his breath, though the sound was hollow in the stillness. The neighbors had warned him, though not directly. They muttered stories that seemed to hover like smoke around the estate. One tale claimed that during the height of the Cold War the owners had dealings that reached far beyond Connecticut. Another insisted that the family had simply disappeared, their fortune eaten away by debts, their legacy swallowed by shame. Yet none of them had dared step close enough to verify their whispers. Michael told himself he didn't care. He was here to clear the gardens, not to unravel mysteries. Still, he could not ignore the strange weight of history that seemed to linger in every vine, every crack in the stone, every locked door. By midday, he had already filled 3 bags with cuttings and broken branches. Sweat soaked his shirt, and his arms ached from hacking at undergrowth that had been left untamed for decades. He took a break beneath the shadow of a twisted oak at the edge of the property, sipping water and staring at the mansion that loomed above him. He wondered how many people had lived here, how many footsteps had echoed through its halls before the silence had claimed it. The longer he looked, the more he felt as though the house itself was waiting, patient and implacable, for someone to disturb it again. There was something almost deliberate about the overgrowth. The vines did not just grow, they wrapped and smothered, binding stair rails and windows until no light could penetrate. Thickets seemed arranged as barriers, as if shielding some secret. Michael caught himself thinking like this and shook his head. Plants didn't have motives, but the impression remained, gnawing at the edge of his concentration, feeding into that nagging awareness that this was no ordinary property. When evening approached and the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across the cracked fountain, Michael gathered his tools and loaded them back into his truck. The day had left him exhausted, yet restless. He had barely scratched the surface of what needed to be done. Tomorrow he would begin earlier, push deeper into the heart of the garden, carve paths through the thickets until the bones of the original design began to reveal themselves again. He tried to dismiss the unease that still clung to him, the faint sense that the mansion had eyes and that the garden concealed more than weeds and rubble. As he locked the gates behind him and looked back one last time, the air seemed to still even further, as though the entire estate were holding its breath. He told himself it was just his imagination, the fatigue of labor mixing with old stories he had overheard, but in truth, he felt a shiver run along his spine. He had worked at many abandoned places, yet none had left him with the same certainty that he was standing at the threshold of something hidden, something that would not reveal itself easily. The house and its garden had been waiting for someone to peel back the layers of time, and Michael, though he did not yet know it, had been chosen by fate to do exactly that. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove away through the darkening street. Behind him, the mansion stood silent in the fading light, its walls draped in ivy like burial shrouds, its broken windows glinting faintly as if reflecting secrets from long ago. Tomorrow, Michael would return with sharper blades and stronger resolve. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work, and with each branch he cut, with each root he pulled, the past would edge closer to the surface. The hidden heart of the estate waited beneath layers of earth and vine, patient as stone, ready to expose itself when the first persistent hand reached into its shadows. And Michael, though weary and unaware, had already taken the first step onto that path. The following morning dawned with a heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on the earth, making every sound muffled, every shadow longer. Michael rose earlier than usual, his body still aching from the previous day's work, but his determination sharpened by the challenge ahead. He drank his coffee in silence, packed his tools into the truck, and set out toward the mansion, the same unease from the day before curling inside him like smoke. The streets were quiet as he drove, lined with trees whose leaves whispered in the wind. When he reached the gates and swung them open, the garden beyond looked even more chaotic than he remembered, as though the night had given the wild growth strength to creep further. He began with the familiar routine of clearing the paths closest to the fountain. His trimmer roared to life, slicing through grass that had risen almost to his chest. Each cut revealed fragments of stone walkways beneath, pale and cracked, but still intact. He worked methodically, the sweat already beading on his forehead. The hours slipped by in rhythm. Cut, pull, stack, load, and soon he had filled more bags of cuttings than he could count. Yet, for every section cleared, 3 more seemed to wait, dense and forbidding. The garden stretched deeper than it appeared from the gate, an entire wilderness wrapped around the mansion like a fortress. By midday he had worked his way past the broken fountain and into a section of the grounds that felt different from the rest. Here, the vegetation was not only thick but oddly organized. Massive tangles of vines had twisted into barriers, woven tight as though deliberately placed. Thorns caught his gloves and scratched his forearms when he tried to push through, leaving small streaks of blood. The ground was uneven, bulging as though something beneath was forcing the earth upward. Michael frowned, pausing to catch his breath. His instincts told him that what lay hidden here was no simple accident of nature. He pushed harder, hacking at the vines with his machete now, since the trimmer's blades could not keep up with the density of the growth. Each swing exposed a little more of what was beneath, and slowly the shape began to reveal itself. It was not just another section of wall, nor the remnants of garden structures. His blade clanged loudly against metal, the sound so sharp in the quiet that he flinched. He crouched low, brushing aside the cut foliage, and there it was, a corner of rusted iron, streaked brown and orange with age, jutting out from under the roots. At first, he thought it might be a part of an old irrigation system or the lid of some forgotten utility hatch. But as he cleared more, cutting and pulling at the stubborn growth, the shape grew larger. What emerged was the edge of a heavy door set flush into the earth, its surface eaten by corrosion, but its purpose unmistakable. It was a door meant to conceal, not to invite. The realization made him sit back on his heels, panting, staring at the discovery. The vines had done more than cover it, they had bound it, their roots plunging deep into the soil around the frame, weaving across the surface like veins. Michael felt a chill crawl along his arms despite the heat of his labor. He ran a gloved hand across the rough iron. The door was large, nearly as tall as he was, built with a strength that suggested it had been designed to last. It had no obvious handle, only a corroded lock plate at the center, thick and heavy, the kind that had once required a special key or mechanism. He stood slowly, stepping back to take in the sight. The garden around him seemed suddenly hushed, as if the air itself had recognized what he had uncovered. A door hidden beneath decades of earth and vegetation was not the sort of thing one stumbled upon in ordinary work. Questions swirled through his mind. Why had it been concealed so deliberately? What could possibly lie behind it? Michael tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was probably just an old root cellar or a forgotten storm shelter. Properties this old often carried remnants of another age, structures built for practical reasons and then abandoned. Yet the rational explanation did little to ease the unease that gnawed at him. The very size of the door suggested importance, and the way the land had seemed to rise over it, as though nature itself had conspired to keep it hidden, gave him the unsettling impression that it was meant to remain undisturbed. Still, his curiosity only grew. He worked longer into the afternoon than he had planned, determined to clear the entire surface. He hacked and pulled until the last of the vines fell away, revealing the door in its full form, a broad slab of iron with hinges so thick they looked more suited to a fortress gate than to something buried in a garden. The lock plate was cracked with rust, its edges sharp and jagged but still formidable. He crouched again, pressing his fingers along the seam where door met frame, and felt the coolness of metal beneath the grime. The discovery left him unsettled in a way he could not quite articulate. The overgrown garden had always felt heavy, as though its silence carried meaning, but now the weight of that silence bore down on him with undeniable force. The door was not supposed to be found. Of that he was certain. Whether it had been built to guard against something coming in or to keep something trapped within, he could not guess. As the sun dipped lower, painting the broken fountain in streaks of orange, Michael finally stepped away. He was exhausted, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat, his gloves shredded from battling thorns and roots. Yet he could not take his eyes from the door. Its presence pulled at him, demanding answers, daring him to take the next step. He told himself he would leave it for now, finish the rest of the work first, but even as he gathered his tools and walked back toward his truck, he knew he was lying to himself. The discovery had lodged in his mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. He had uncovered something more than vines and weeds. He had unearthed the first thread of a secret buried for decades. As he closed the gates behind him once again, the memory of the door pressed against his thoughts, heavy and insistent. Tomorrow he would return, and tomorrow he would not be able to resist the urge to see what lay beyond. And though he tried to convince himself it was simply curiosity, deep down Michael felt the stirrings of something larger, something that had been waiting for him all along. The mansion's silence was no longer just neglect. It was anticipation, a quiet breath held for decades, released now because a gardener with steady hands and relentless will had chosen to cut deeper than anyone before. The lock might be rusted, but the secrets it kept were alive, and he knew, even without admitting it aloud, that he would not rest until he had torn them open. That night, Michael barely slept. He tossed in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every detail of the iron door. It seemed to hang behind his eyes when he closed them, its rusted surface pulsing in the dark like some malignant heartbeat. He told himself over and over that he was overreacting, that what he had found was nothing more than a root cellar or a storm shelter, but his body betrayed him. His chest tightened whenever he thought of the way the vines had twined across the surface like tendrils deliberately binding it shut, and the way the earth had heaved upward as if to bury it forever. Sleep, when it came, was restless and fractured, filled with strange dreams of heavy footsteps echoing underground and whispers muffled by walls of stone. By morning, his exhaustion felt like a weight pressing against his ribs, but he was driven by a need that went beyond curiosity. He had to open the door. The drive back to the mansion seemed longer than usual, every traffic light holding him in place like an unspoken warning. He ignored the tension in his gut, gripping the wheel until his knuckles whitened, his eyes fixed on the empty street that curved toward the old gates. When he arrived, the air around the property seemed thicker than before. Even the morning bird song that had accompanied his earlier visits was absent, as though the estate itself had quieted to observe him. He parked the truck and sat for a long moment, staring at the iron gates with the knowledge that beyond them lay a choice he could no longer avoid. His tools rattled as he pulled them from the back of the truck, crowbar and flashlight among them. He slung his pack over his shoulder, pushed open the gates, and walked down the path toward the fountain, his boots crunching against the gravel. Every step carried him deeper into a silence that pressed harder against his ears, until he swore he could hear his own pulse louder than the sound of his footsteps. The garden, though partially cleared now, still loomed around him, walls of green pressing in from either side. The mansion itself, standing behind its curtain of ivy, seemed to recede into shadow, its darkened windows like the blank stares of something long dead. When he reached the door, his breath caught. It was exactly as he had left it, yet it felt altered. Now that it was fully exposed, its shape more defined against the earth, it seemed to radiate a presence that pulled him closer. He crouched, running his fingers along the corroded edges of the lock plate. The metal was cool beneath his gloves despite the heat of the morning. For several minutes he simply sat there, staring, feeling both foolish and compelled. Finally, with a deep breath that trembled in his chest, he set the crowbar against the seam and pushed. The first effort was futile. The lock held with stubborn resistance, groaning but refusing to yield. He tried again, throwing the weight of his body into it, sweat breaking across his forehead. At last, with a sound like a bone snapping, the lock plate cracked. Rust crumbled away in flakes, scattering across the earth like brittle confetti. The door groaned loudly as the hinges shifted, the sound echoing with an unnatural weight in the quiet garden. Michael stumbled back, his heart hammering, but the door now stood ajar, a crack of darkness yawning beneath him. The smell hit him first. Damp, stale, metallic. It was the scent of earth that had not seen air in decades, mingled with the faint tang of rust and rot. He shone his flashlight into the gap and saw a narrow staircase of concrete descending into blackness. The beam of light revealed dust swirling in the air, disturbed after so many years, as though the darkness itself were waking from sleep. For a long moment, he stood frozen, the light trembling in his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it, to seal the door and walk away, but another voice inside him whispered more insistently, "Go down." He placed one foot on the first step, the concrete cold even through the sole of his boot. The sound of his tread echoed hollowly, reverberating into the depths. He paused, listening, his breath loud in the silence. No response came from below, only the faint drip of water somewhere deep within. He descended slowly, each step heavier than the last, the air growing cooler with every foot he dropped. Shadows crowded the corners of the stairwell, recoiling from the beam of his flashlight, yet always pressing close again when the light moved on. As he went deeper, his unease sharpened into something more physical. The air was damp, clinging to his skin, and carried a faint metallic bite that made the back of his throat ache. The smell of mold was stronger now, joined by the sharper tang of something like oil or rusting iron. He ran his free hand along the wall for balance and felt the roughness of unfinished concrete, pitted and damp to the touch. The sound of dripping water grew louder, and with it the echo of his own footsteps, each one amplified until it seemed he was accompanied by another set trailing just behind him. Finally, the staircase ended at a small landing. Ahead stood another door, larger than the one above, built of thick steel. It was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges, as if someone had forced it once before and never closed it again. Michael froze, his flashlight beam quivering against the surface. The sight of it sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Whoever had built this place had intended for it to be sealed, secure, hidden. The fact that the door now stood partly open filled him with both dread and expectation. He swallowed, his mouth dry, and pushed the door with the end of his crowbar. It gave way with a long, low groan that reverberated through the underground space a sound that seemed far too loud, as though announcing his presence to anyone, or anything within. He raised his flashlight and swept it across the room beyond. The light fell on concrete walls lined with shelves, the faint glint of metal reflecting back. Dust thickened the air, swirling in ghostly patterns. Shadows stretched across the floor, concealing shapes he could not immediately discern. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement, a flicker in the dark that vanished when he swung the light back. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath caught, but nothing moved again. He stepped inside, the sound of his boots crunching on grit echoing unnaturally loud. The beam of the flashlight revealed more details. Rusted containers stacked against the far wall, piles of wooden crates crumbling with age, and the faint outline of another corridor leading deeper. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He had crossed the threshold, left behind the safety of sunlight, and entered a world that had been sealed away for decades. Whatever secrets this mansion had guarded were now his to uncover, but he could not shake the feeling that by stepping inside, he had set something in motion that could not be undone. The darkness pressed close, thicker than air, heavier than stone. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and crowbar, telling himself that he had come too far to turn back now. The silence was complete, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that hinted at presence. With every step he took into that first room, Michael knew that the garden above had been hiding something far more than weeds and vines. He had descended into its heart, and there was no turning back. Michael stood frozen just beyond the steel door, the beam of his flashlight trembling as it swept across the strange underground chamber. The first thing that struck him was the scale of the place. It was not a small cellar or storage room as he had expected, but an entire subterranean complex, larger than he could have imagined. The concrete walls stretched outward into shadows that refused to yield easily, and every corner seemed to hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. The air was colder here, heavy with damp, and laced with the musty odor of mold, dust, and something metallic, like iron left to corrode in silence. He swallowed hard, realizing that he had crossed into a space that had not felt the presence of a living soul in decades. The beam of light slid across a table, its surface cluttered with dishes that still held the hardened remains of meals long forgotten. Cups sat overturned, plates covered with a film of dust so thick that he had to blink to believe what he was seeing. It looked as though the people who had once used this place had risen from their seats suddenly and never returned, abandoning their lives mid-gesture. Beside the table, a single wooden chair lay toppled over, as if someone had pushed back from it in haste. The image unsettled him more than any ghost story could, for there was nothing staged about it. This was not the ruin of a space slowly abandoned. It was the frozen remains of a moment interrupted. He moved further inside, the crunch of grit beneath his boots echoing too loudly in the vast silence. His light picked out more details. Bunk beds against the wall, their sheets yellowed with age but still tucked in, each with a pillow dented as though someone had only just risen from it. A small bookshelf leaned precariously in one corner, its spines warped with damp, titles barely legible but speaking of another time. Newspapers were scattered on the floor, the edges brittle and curled, the ink faded but still readable in places. He stooped to pick one up, brushing away dust. The headline screamed of international tension, of missile tests and political threats. It was a relic of the Cold War era. a reminder of the paranoia that had once gripped the world and driven people to build fortresses underground. Michael's flashlight swept across another corner of the room and landed on a set of wooden crates stacked 3 high, their surfaces stenciled with faded letters and numbers. The wood had darkened with moisture, but some markings were still visible. Military codes, perhaps, or supply designations. His heart thudded as he realized what they might contain. He hesitated, then stepped closer, the floor creaking faintly under his weight. Though there was no wood here to creak, only the sound of shifting in the silence, magnified by his imagination. He brushed the grime away from one crate, exposing a series of characters that looked foreign to him, and then pulled back quickly, as though the markings themselves were dangerous. The room seemed to stretch further the more he explored, each beam of light revealing another corner of this buried world. He found a narrow hallway branching off from the main chamber, its floor littered with debris and what looked like the remnants of cardboard boxes. He followed it cautiously, the air growing thicker, the smell of mildew stronger. The corridor led to a smaller room that must once have been a kitchen. Rusted pots hung from hooks, their surfaces pitted with holes, while shelves sagged under the weight of jars whose labels had long since disintegrated. A sink sat in the corner, its basin coated with rust, and beneath it, a bucket filled with stagnant water that rippled faintly as his light fell upon it. He turned back, the beam of his flashlight quivering as though reflecting his own unease. The main chamber seemed larger now, looming as he returned, the shadows stretching taller, swallowing more than they revealed. His eyes caught on the walls where strange marks stained the concrete, long, dark streaks running down as though water had seeped in over the years. Yet some of the stains looked too sharp, too deliberate, and the thought that they might not all be water made him shiver. He turned his light upward, revealing pipes running across the ceiling, corroded and dripping, adding to the chorus of faint echoes. Michael paused beside the table once more, his eyes drifting across the plates and cups. He imagined the people who had once sat there, a family perhaps, or a group of men huddled away from the chaos of the outside world, their voices filling the space where now there was only silence. What had driven them away so suddenly? Why had they not taken their belongings, their food, their lives with them? He felt the answer pressing against him in the still air, though no words were spoken. This place had been abandoned in haste, left behind like a secret too heavy to carry. The more he looked, the more the details unsettled him. A child's toy lay forgotten beneath one of the bunks, a small wooden car with wheels chipped and cracked. Beside it, a book with pages warped by damp lay open to a story half read. These fragments of ordinary life only deepened the eeriness, for they were not relics of strangers, but echoes of lives lived in this underground prison of safety. Michael imagined the fear that must have driven them here, the conviction that the world above could end at any moment. Yet he could not escape the feeling that something else had driven them out, something sudden, something left unspoken. He ran his hand along the nearest wall, the concrete rough beneath his fingertips, damp seeping into his skin. The structure was solid, built to withstand catastrophe, and yet it had not been enough to keep those who lived here inside. His light fell upon another door at the far end of the chamber, this one smaller, lighter, its surface mottled with rust but still closed. He approached it slowly, each step measured, his pulse quickening. The door stood like a sentinel, separating him from whatever lay beyond. Michael hesitated, the memory of the first door and the effort it had taken to open fresh in his mind. He raised his hand and pushed gently. To his surprise, it gave way easily, the hinges squealing in protest as it swung inward. The room beyond was darker still, the air heavier, the smell sharper. He shone his light inside and froze. Against the wall stood more crates, but these were different, smaller, metal, and unmistakably military. The beam glinted off their surfaces, revealing stenciled warnings and faded paint. He stepped back instinctively, his breath catching. These were not supplies for survival. They were weapons. The realization spread through him like ice. The bunker was not merely a shelter for a family in fear, it was a stockpile, a hidden arsenal, concealed beneath the earth of a forgotten estate. The food, the beds, the newspapers, those had been the trappings of ordinary life. But this room told another story entirely. Whatever family had lived here had not simply been hiding. They had been preparing. Michael's hands shook as he lowered the beam, the shadows seeming to crowd closer around him. The silence of the underground rooms no longer felt neutral. It felt watchful, as if the past itself lingered in the walls, waiting for him to uncover the whole of its secret. He turned slowly, his light sweeping once more across the chamber filled with frozen lives. Every object, every scrap of paper, every rusted utensil seemed to hum with unspoken history. He was no longer just a gardener clearing weeds. He was an intruder in a story that had not ended, a trespasser in the middle of a life abruptly cut off. As he stood there, the weight of it all pressing against his chest, he realized that he could not walk away now. The underground rooms had revealed themselves, but not fully. Somewhere deeper in the shadows lay the truth, and though fear gnawed at him, though every instinct told him to leave, he knew he would return. The mansion had drawn him into its silence, and the silence had opened a door. Now, whatever lay hidden in the dark was calling him to uncover it. Michael lingered in the shadows of the underground chamber, his flashlight beam trembling over the crates that bore faded military markings. The discovery left him shaken in a way that the abandoned bunks and scattered dishes had not. Those things were unsettling, yes, but they spoke of ordinary lives interrupted, of people who had hidden here in fear. This was different. These metal boxes were not meant for sustenance, but for destruction. The painted warnings on their rusted surfaces seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and for a moment he felt as though he stood in the center of something dangerous, a vault of power hidden beneath decades of soil and silence. He crouched down and brushed a hand across the corroded lid of the nearest container. The paint flaked away under his touch, exposing bare metal cold against his glove. He considered prying it open, but a sudden chill of caution swept through him. Whatever rested inside had been left here untouched for half a century, and time could transform once stable materials into volatile hazards. His heart thudded as he drew his hand back, suddenly aware that he might have been one careless move away from disaster. He stepped back, his breath quickening, the weight of the silence deepening around him. He forced himself to turn the flashlight away from the crates, sweeping it across the rest of the chamber. On the far wall, partly hidden behind a stack of collapsed shelves, he saw a cluster of old filing cabinets, their metal warped and stained with rust. Papers spilled out from one drawer that hung crookedly, sheets yellowed and curling at the edges. He approached cautiously, every step echoing on the concrete floor. When he pulled the drawer further open, the smell of mildew and age thickened, a sour scent that made him wrinkle his nose. Yet, despite the damage, the papers were still legible. He lifted one carefully, the fragile page crumbling slightly under his fingers. It was a typed letter dated from the mid-1960s, addressed to the man who had once owned the mansion. The language was clipped, bureaucratic, filled with references to contracts, shipments, and coded identifiers. Michael's eyes caught on certain words that sent a shiver down his spine: munitions, distribution, offshore accounts. This was not simply a personal shelter for a frightened family. This had been a place tied to darker business, to weapons trading and deals conducted far from public scrutiny. He set the letter aside and picked up another document, this one bearing stamps and seals that suggested official approval, though it was impossible to tell whether they were authentic or forged. Diagrams were scribbled in the margins, sketches of crates, inventories, and quantities. He realized with growing unease that the crates in front of him likely matched these records. Whoever had built this bunker had done so not only to protect themselves from nuclear fear, but to hide something lucrative, something illicit. Michael leafed through more pages, each revealing fragments of the same truth. Some spoke of stockpiles being moved through channels and to clients overseas. Others referred obliquely to government contracts never completed, to assets rerouted for private gain. The language was always vague enough to avoid clarity, but the pattern was undeniable. The previous owner of the mansion had been more than just wealthy. He had been involved in a network of clandestine operations that reached far beyond this quiet town in Connecticut. His flashlight beam fell upon a photograph tucked between two folders. He lifted it gingerly, brushing away the dust. The black and white image showed a man in a tailored suit standing proudly in the garden above, the mansion in the background still pristine in its glory. Beside him stood a woman and two children, all dressed immaculately, their faces frozen in confident smiles. It was a portrait of prosperity, but knowing what he now knew, Michael could not look at it without feeling a wave of disquiet. The children's toys scattered around the bunk beds suddenly seemed less innocent, reminders of a family whose life had been built atop secrets and weapons. He found more photographs, men in uniforms shaking hands with the mansion's owner, gatherings where crates similar to the ones behind him were stacked in the background. The expressions were always the same: stiff, purposeful, men bound by deals they would never admit in public. Michael felt the walls of the bunker closing in on him as he pieced the fragments together. This had been more than a shelter. It had been a hub, a hidden chamber where history's darker currents had flowed unseen. His light flicked across the walls again, and he noticed something carved into the concrete near one of the bunks. He moved closer, brushing away grime to reveal words etched deeply into the surface. They were initials, a date, and a short phrase: "Waiting is worse than death." The message struck him like a blow. Someone had lived here long enough, in fear or despair, to carve those words into stone. He could almost imagine the hand that had scratched the letters, the sound of metal against concrete in the suffocating silence of this underground world. Michael's mind swam with questions. Why had the family abandoned this place so suddenly? Had they been discovered, or had their own dealings caught up with them? And what of the stockpiles that remained here, dangerous and forgotten? The answers seemed to pulse in the silence, just out of reach, as though the walls themselves whispered fragments he could not quite hear. He turned his light back to the crates, to the documents, to the forgotten dishes on the table. A story was emerging from the fragments, a story of power, secrecy, and fear. Yet there were still gaps too wide to bridge. The bunker was a time capsule, yes, but it was also a labyrinth, and he had only begun to map its corridors. The deeper he went, the more he felt the pull of responsibility. He was no historian, no journalist, no soldier, but he had uncovered something that could not remain in silence forever. Yet another part of him resisted. The discovery was dangerous, not only in its contents, but in its implications. If these weapons or documents came into the wrong hands, the consequences could ripple far beyond this forgotten estate. Michael set the papers down, his hands trembling slightly. His flashlight beam shifted across the chamber one more time, catching on the doorway that led deeper still. He realized that he had not yet reached the end of this hidden world. More rooms waited in the darkness, and with them, perhaps the final pieces of the story. But already, in this chamber, the weight of the past pressed heavily on him. He understood now that this was not just about history. It was about choices made long ago, choices that had left behind shadows capable of reaching into the present. The abandoned plates, the forgotten toy, the crates marked with warnings. All of it told a tale of fear and greed, of survival entangled with secrecy. And Michael, against his will, had become its witness. He stood in the dim light, the silence stretching endlessly, and realized that leaving this place without telling anyone was no longer an option. Yet, even as that thought crossed his mind, another followed swiftly on its heels. If he revealed what he had found, the peace of this small town would shatter. The story would explode beyond his control, and whatever fragile safety he felt now would vanish. Michael exhaled slowly, the weight of decision pressing against him. The bunker's secrets had survived decades untouched, but now that he had uncovered them, they could not remain buried. Whether he wanted it or not, the past had claimed him, and somewhere in the darkness of those deeper corridors he sensed the most dangerous truth still waited. Michael left the underground rooms with his heart hammering, each step up the concrete staircase heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker now, as though the bunker clung to him even after he had climbed back into the light of day. He pushed the rusted door shut behind him, but the sound of it scraping against its frame echoed in his ears long after silence had returned. Standing once more in the garden, surrounded by wild grass and the hum of insects, he felt a strange disorientation. The sun was still in the sky, the mansion loomed as it always had, and yet the world seemed altered, as if some hidden layer of reality had been peeled back to reveal the rot beneath. He leaned on his knees, sweat running down his temples, trying to steady himself. He thought of the papers, the crates, the words carved into the wall. He thought of the photograph of the family who had smiled in their garden, masking secrets in the basement of their grand estate. The images flickered in his mind like a reel of film spliced together without order, each one heavier than the last. He had uncovered something immense, something dangerous, and it pressed down on him with a weight greater than the earth that had buried it for decades. That night, back in his small apartment, Michael could not find rest. The sounds of the city, the distant honk of horns, the low rumble of traffic, the occasional shout from the street, usually lulled him with their familiarity. But now they felt far away, muffled beneath the hum of his own thoughts. He sat at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of him, the hands of the clock ticking toward midnight, staring at nothing and everything at once. His mind played out the possibilities, each one heavier than the last. If he kept silent, no one would ever know what he had found. The door could be covered again, the garden restored, the past left to rot in its underground tomb. Life would go on. He could finish his job, cash his paycheck, and walk away. Yet the thought sat in him like a stone. Those crates had not simply been relics of history. They were threats, potential dangers still present after all these years. The wrong hands could turn them into something catastrophic. And the documents, what he had glimpsed of them, told a story that would tear open the image of the family who had once owned this place, a story that might ripple far beyond this small town. But if he spoke, if he brought the authorities into it, everything would change. The mansion would become a site swarmed by officials, historians, journalists. His name would be dragged into the public eye, the gardener who had uncovered a Cold War arsenal hidden in the soil of Connecticut. He imagined the headlines, the questions, the relentless press. His quiet life would end. Worse, he could not predict what the consequences would be for the community, or what shadows from the past might awaken when exposed to the light. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, exhaustion pressing down on him. The decision clawed at him, a battle between self-preservation and responsibility. Every time he leaned toward silence, the image of the carved words on the concrete wall returned to him. Waiting is worse than death. Someone had etched their despair into stone, trapped in that bunker, living in fear. Could he, knowing that, simply leave it buried? And every time he leaned toward speaking out, he imagined the chaos that would follow, the spotlight blazing down on him, the loss of everything he valued in his quiet life. Hours slipped past in this struggle, the night stretching into early morning. He rose from the table and paced his small apartment, running his hands through his hair, muttering half-formed thoughts to himself. At one point, he stood at the window, staring down at the street, watching a lone figure walk under the street lamp. He envied the stranger's ignorance, the simplicity of their night. They carried no burden heavier than their own shadow, while he carried the weight of a secret that could alter the fabric of the world around him. By dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his body aching from sleeplessness, but his mind had found no peace. He drove back to the mansion, the rising sun casting long beams of light across the road, the morning sky pale and indifferent. The gates creaked open with the same metallic groan. The garden lay waiting with its tangled vines and silent fountain, but everything felt charged, like the pause before a storm. He walked back to the door, crouched beside it, and touched the cold surface of the iron once more. The choice was still before him, but the act of returning told him what he already knew. He could not leave it behind. The rest of the day passed in a blur of labor, but his thoughts never left the underground. As he cut vines, dragged branches, and cleared debris, his mind returned again and again to the sight of those crates, to the fragile papers filled with secrets, to the child's toy left abandoned in a world meant for survival, but corrupted by greed. His hands worked automatically, but his spirit wrestled with the decision, turning it over until it felt raw and frayed. When night fell again, he returned home with dirt on his clothes and blisters on his palms, but still no answer. He sat once more at his kitchen table, the silence of his apartment pressing in, and realized that the choice was no longer about whether to speak or remain silent. It was about who he was. Was he a man who walked away from danger, leaving it to others to handle, or was he someone who shouldered the burden, no matter the cost? The weight of that question pressed into him harder than any tool, heavier than any labor he had ever done. Sleep, when it finally came, was fractured again, filled with images of doors and shadows, of faces smiling in photographs while hiding secrets in the earth beneath their feet. He woke before dawn with the certainty that the decision would not be delayed forever. The past had chosen him, dragged him into its silence, and demanded a voice. He knew now that he would have to give it one, even if the price was higher than he could bear. As he stood once more before the gates the following morning, the garden silent, the mansion looming, the iron door waiting in its nest of vines and earth, Michael felt the moment closing in. The choice was no longer distant. It pressed at his ribs, filled his lungs, whispered in the silence of the forgotten estate. One way or another he would act, and when he did, the weight of history would rise from the shadows he had disturbed, changing his life forever. The morning after his sleepless night arrived with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Michael knew as he stood by the rusted door, his hand resting on its cold surface, that he could not turn away any longer. The silence of the estate pressed at him from every side, and the weight of what he had uncovered left no room for hesitation. The choice that had haunted him through every restless hour had crystallized into inevitability. He had seen too much, understood too clearly the danger that lingered beneath the soil. To remain silent was to accept responsibility for whatever might come of it, and that was a burden he could not carry. The call was not easy. His fingers hovered over his phone for several minutes before he finally pressed the numbers, each one harder than the last. His voice shook when he explained what he had found, struggling to sound calm as he described the hidden bunker, the crates, the papers. The dispatcher on the other end fell silent for a long moment before asking him to repeat everything slowly. By the time he hung up, his stomach churned with the reality of what he had set in motion. There was no going back. The first to arrive were the police, their cars rolling up the cracked driveway, lights flashing silently in the morning sun. They stepped out cautiously, uncertain of what to expect, their eyes narrowing as Michael led them toward the garden. He guided them to the door, his hands trembling as he pulled the vines aside to show them what he had uncovered. Their faces shifted from skepticism to alarm as they looked down the concrete staircase, the beam of a flashlight bouncing across the walls. One officer muttered under his breath, and another radioed for backup almost immediately. Soon, the property was alive with activity. More police came, followed by men in heavy protective gear, their uniforms marked with bomb disposal insignia. Trucks pulled into the driveway, equipment unloaded with grim efficiency. Michael watched from the edge of the garden, his arms folded tightly across his chest, as they descended into the darkness he had braved alone. The silence was broken now by clipped voices, the clatter of metal, the sharp commands of experts who understood better than he the magnitude of what lay below. Hours passed in tense waves. At times, the officers ordered him further back, their movements cautious as though a single misstep could unravel everything. He caught fragments of their words: unstable, deteriorated, volatile, and each one confirmed what his instincts had warned him. The crates he had seen were not merely relics, they were hazards, dormant but still alive with the potential for destruction. As the day stretched on, other vehicles arrived. A van, marked with the seal of a historical society, pulled up, and men and women in neat clothes stepped out with clipboards and cameras. They spoke to the police, gaining permission to examine the documents and personal artifacts recovered from the bunker. Michael saw them emerge carrying boxes of papers, yellowed photographs, and the child's toy he had noticed beneath the bunk. Their faces were pale with the realization of what they were handling. News traveled fast. By evening, journalists had gathered outside the gates, their cameras flashing as they tried to catch glimpses through the iron bars. Questions were shouted, voices clamored for answers, and though the police held them back, The story was already spilling beyond the boundaries of the estate. Michael heard snippets of what they said, words like Cold War cache and hidden arsenal, and knew that by nightfall the world beyond this small town would know what had been uncovered. The new owner of the mansion arrived in a sleek car, his expression a mixture of confusion and dread as officers briefed him. Michael saw the man's face pale as the scale of the discovery was explained. This was no ordinary property restoration anymore. His estate had become the epicenter of a revelation that would bring endless scrutiny. The owner cast a bewildered glance toward Michael, perhaps wondering how the gardener he had hired to clear weeds had stumbled onto something that would redefine his property forever. By nightfall, the garden that had once been silent and oppressive was filled with floodlights. The fountain gleamed ghostly under the beams, the mansion's walls casting long shadows as men worked tirelessly to remove the last of the dangerous crates. Each was lifted with painstaking care, placed into reinforced containers, and driven away under escort. The air buzzed with tension, but also with relief as, one by one, the weapons that had slumbered underground were carried out into the open. Historians clustered near the recovered documents, their voices hushed but urgent as they pieced together fragments of the past. They spoke of a wealthy man whose fear of annihilation had fused with greed, of connections that stretched across borders, of secrets that explained the sudden disappearance of a family long whispered about in the town. The photographs of men in uniform shaking hands with the mansion's owner were passed from one gloved hand to another, each face examined, each background scrutinized. The story was no longer myth but evidence, cold and undeniable. Michael watched it all unfold from the edge of the property, the weight in his chest shifting with each passing hour. He felt relief, yes, that the danger was being handled by those who understood it, but he also felt the irreversible change in his own life. The quiet man who had come here to cut vines and clear brush was gone. In his place stood a figure marked by discovery, by the decision to unearth what had been buried. He had not sought recognition, but he knew it would find him all the same. As the night deepened, a final sweep of the bunker was completed, and the last of the crates were driven away. The officers spoke of cordoning off the estate, of continuing investigations, of more teams arriving in the days to come. The mansion was no longer simply abandoned. It was a crime scene, a museum, a reminder. Michael felt the eyes of the journalists lingering on him, even from a distance, their whispers carrying his name. He knew they would want his story, the words of the man who had found the door. But he had no story to give them beyond the truth. He had been doing his job, clearing a garden, when the past reached up from the soil and refused to stay buried. Later, when the floodlights dimmed and the crews packed their equipment, Michael stood alone in the garden. The mansion loomed above, its windows dark and hollow, its silence restored but forever altered. He felt the cool night air brush against his skin, carrying with it the faint smell of rust and earth. He thought of the family whose smiles had been captured in photographs, of the child's toy abandoned beneath a bunk, of the words carved into stone by someone who had lived in fear. The past had bled into the present, and he had become its witness. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the tension leaving him in fragments. He did not know what would come next, what attention or consequences his discovery would bring. But he knew one thing with certainty. The secret was no longer hidden. The silence of the mansion had been broken, its shadowed heart dragged into the light, and as he walked back toward the gates, leaving behind the estate that would never again be forgotten, he felt both smaller and heavier. The world had changed because he had chosen not to turn away, and though his life would never be the same, he carried within him the quiet knowledge that sometimes uncovering the past is the only way to protect the future. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss the next shocking discoveries waiting to be told. Click on the next video on your screen. You'll be stunned by what's hidden there. And don't keep this secret to yourself. Share this video with your friends so they can uncover the mystery too.